I'm not going to say too much. I'm looking forward to a conversation, but I do want to get the basic ideas of this particular perspective on reparations I'm defending up and out there, and say a little bit about why it's important now. So in the era of climate change is the subtitle of this presentation goes. The basic thing that I think that the book is about, the basic contentions of the perspective are these two. One, it's about what reparations is. So reparations for the particular eras of history that I'm talking about requires remaking the world. And the particular form that this takes in the 21st century against the political circumstances and ecological circumstances that confront us right now, I think means that reparations and climate justice converge. So a bit on the first claim, why this world-making view of reparations? This isn't a general theory of reparations. I'm not talking about reparations for any conceivable atrocity. I'm talking about reparations for transatlantic slavery and colonialism. I think the reason why reparations in response to those eras and epochs should be world-making is partially because of how I understand transatlantic slavery and colonialism, which is as world-making. The world order that we live in, the planet-sized social and economic system that we inhabit right now, I argue in the book, was built by transatlantic slavery and colonialism. And so reparations for that should take a task of the same size and scope. I don't think this is a new view of racial justice. Getachu's book, World Making After Empire, argued that anti-colonial nationalist movements, particularly in Africa, began with a recognition of the planetary scale of racial and colonial injustice. So I'm just applying this term to a political sensibility that was not only present in the past, but actually the prevailing view in a past era of history. And I'm just giving a particular kind of theoretical spin on that prevailing view. So what is it that I mean to say when I say that transatlantic slavery and colonialism built the world? I'm trying to give an account like what's on the slide. So I just, for ease of reference, I grouped transatlantic slavery and colonialism under the term global racial empire, because that's what I think it was. And I'm trying to give a kind of framework for figuring out what the left side of the screen has to do with the right side of the screen. So on the left, you find a particular data point, a particular result of social scientific inquiry in one time in one country. So in the United States, two separate reports, one by the General Accounting Office, federal government investigative body, and one by the United Church of Christ, produced reports showing that 3 out of 5 Latino and Black Americans live near toxic waste sites. Now, this is, of course, not to argue that there's some deep conceptual necessary connection between these demographic categories, being Latino or being Black American, and the idea of toxic waste. There is, nevertheless, I'm trying to argue, a causal connection. So if you search through social science, you'll find a million results of the kind on the left. And I think you can generalize from these results to a broader picture of how it is that the world operates. And that is described on the right. So the global social structure that resulted from transatlantic slavery and colonialism, which I call global racial empire, but which is pretty much the same basic analysis as you'll find under the heading of quote, racial capitalism. And I'm just proposing a way of understanding the general tendencies of this system. I'm thinking of them as a set of processes that constitute a distributive system. So social advantages and social advantages accumulate in the global north and in racially advantaged communities. So the usual suspects, things like wealth and money, but also things that we wouldn't necessarily think of in the same way as wealth and money, things like research capacity or state capacity, things like research knowledge. Those things accumulate in parts of the world and for particular kinds of people, notably in the global north and racially advantaged communities, broadly speaking. By that same token, social disadvantages are produced and distributed across the world, and these tend to end up and accumulate in global south communities, in the global south part of the world, and in racially disadvantaged communities. Right? This holds both within and across political communities. All of that is to say that what the world is, as I'm thinking of it, is a production and distribution system, and where things end up and to whom they end up is broadly what explains social realities. So racial injustice is being understood on these terms rather. So where housing security and insecurity ends up, where food, energy, and water security and insecurity end up, has these broad features, especially on a global scale. Where political power ends up has these broad features. And if we want racial justice, what we're doing, literally, definitionally, is changing how these things are distributed and the system that distributes them. That's all things I argue or describe, perhaps is better to say, early on in the book. This is a broad perspective. And along the way in developing this perspective, one of the things that I go through some pains to note is that this system was built. Right? We have existed as a species for millions of years. Having a planet-sized economic and political system is very, very recent in human history. I think the broad consensus from historians is that you have a planet-sized system towards the end of the 16th century, right, in the 1570s. So we're talking about a few centuries of human history where we've had a system this large, encompassing this much of the planet, that links human activity, human politics, human economics, and crucially, the ecological ramifications of all of those things on a planetary scale. That's new. It's different from what preceded it in history. And it was built by transatlantic slavery and colonialism. The construction of that network just was the colonial conquests and trade networks built out of colonial conquests and slave economies. So I'm talking in very abstract terms about how to understand what parts of this matter and what parts are important, but I also talk in very concrete terms about how we got here, which just was, again, transatlantic slavery and colonialism. So in responding to a history that has both those descriptive features, that is a distribution system that works in the way that I'm arguing it does or contending that it does, I think that reframes in a way that I hope is helpful what reparations ought to be about. It's responding to this kind of unprecedented global construction process that was built on injustice. And if we want reparatory justice for that, I think we should try to think in those same kinds of terms about what a response in the direction of justice might be. So one of the things I talk about explicitly in the book are what the standards are for evaluating different reparations arguments. We have this historical perspective about what reparations arguments are responding to. How do we sort out which are the good responses and which are the less good responses? So I have these three criteria, which are put in rank order of importance. The first and most important, I think, is that reparations for global racial empire should make tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives. Right? This is why any of this stuff matters, right? It decides who is safe, it decides who is victimized, who is vulnerable, and that is what is important about getting politics right. But standard number two, I think reparations for global racial empire should address the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism to the extent possible, right? Unfortunately, many people have been enslaved and died under the conditions of, the construction of this world system. And there are kinds of reparatory justice that just aren't available, right? Just because people have passed on, and there's forms of reparatory justice that are ruled out by the fact that they've passed on, and that some particular decisions might be ecologically, socially, or politically irreversible or difficult to reverse. I think that's a problem that we should stare in the face. But whatever there's left for us to do to address the moral wrongs and not just the kind of causal effects of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, I think we should do that. And finally, last and least, in my judgment anyway, I do think reparations for global racial empire should discriminate. So how they distribute benefits and burdens should be based on the different relationships of persons and institutions to the core moral wrong. The countries, the corporations, the estates that are most on the hook for the moral liabilities of yesterday should have the most to do in whatever reparations asks of us. So with these criteria in mind, I think about the vast plane of arguments and historical activism for reparations, and I try to group them into families. One way of thinking about reparations, one broad set of approaches to reparations, I call the harm repair view. So on this view, what reparations should do is fix people's levels of welfare. They should repair present harms to individuals or groups that are caused or maybe even constituted by past harms. So they should lift people from one level of life chances and opportunities and levels of wealth and raise them to a higher level. They tend to think about welfare as the thing that explains harm. They tend to group people into two groups that correspond to something like a plaintiff and defendant distinction that you might find in law. And non-incidentally, a lot of these arguments tend to be made by lawyers in law reviews. So it's a model of thinking about harm that is well represented in Western common law. And so there's lots of resources there for making these kinds of arguments. There's a lot of places that you could put pressure on this sort of argument. The bifurcations, the binaries that these arguments tend to split people into tend to cut across distinctions that you might think are very different, like the distinction between white and black, or settler and native, and the distinction between those advantaged by the history of racism and those disadvantaged, both of which might be different from still a third kind of binary between those descended from the enslavers or settlers and those descended from the enslaved or or indigenous folks. So that's one place to put pressure. I'm happy to say more in Q&A. But for now, let's just apply the standards. So I think harm repair arguments do well on standards 1 and 3. They certainly make tangible differences in people's lives. That's what they're for, right? And they certainly discriminate. They split people up into different groups. But I don't think it is an accident that the people whose lives they're trying to improve have, higher levels of toxic waste and lower levels of wealth. The whole political system, economic system, the distribution systems that explain who gets what, and not just the results of those distribution systems, are among the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism. It's because we built an economy that's designed to immiserate some people for the enrichment of others, to prey upon some people for the plunder that goes to other people. Those systemic aspects of things aren't necessarily challenged just by, on the back end, handing people checks or land or dollars. That can certainly improve matters. If we did one thing, maybe it should be that. But I don't think it goes quite far enough. And so I don't think it does quite as well on standard number 2. If the system itself, the pipelines of advantage and disadvantage are the core moral wrongs that we can address, it's not clear that harm repair necessarily addresses it. So the second category of reparations arguments I think about are relationship repair arguments. So on this view, what reparations should do is repair damage to relationships, maybe between groups caused or constituted by past wrongdoing, maybe within groups. So it's trying to make some group of people have a better relationship with something, maybe between African American descendants of the enslaved and their neighbors, maybe between the indigenous First Nations and the Canadian government, so between people and an institution. There are different relationships you could try to fix. But one objection you might have to that project is that maybe it changes the subject. Maybe what we should be trying to do isn't build relationships for the sake of building them, but for the sake of, as Adolf Reed might say, access to quality healthcare, the right to a decent, dignified livelihood, and those kinds of goals. Maybe it isn't an apology or friendship that Black people need, as Coleman Hughes argues. Maybe what they need are safer neighborhoods, better schools, a less punitive criminal justice system. So maybe it changes the subject of reparations from something better that we could be doing with our time. I think something like that objection is probably right. The relationship repair view is a broad category of arguments, just like the harm repair view, so you could do it in different ways. But in general, I would say that these arguments tend to do well on standard 3, right? They ask some people to make amends and perhaps make apologies or communicate that they understand wrongdoing, and they ask other people to be communicated to about those things. But I don't think relationship repair views do well on the first 2 standards. I don't think they necessarily make tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives. At least making differences on that level isn't the point. And I don't think they change the system that pipelines advantages and disadvantages across the world either. And so they don't address the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, as I understand the core moral wrongs that we can still address. So the view that I prefer, I just give the name, I just call the constructive view. Again, it's not something that I'm coming up with. It's just a name I'm giving to an ethos that has long been, that has long existed within the fights for reparations and the broader struggles for racial justice and anti-colonial justice. And this is a transformative vision of reparations. So the way I explain it is that reparations is a political project to create the just world tomorrow. And distribute the costs of that construction project in light of yesterday's injustice. So the countries and corporations who are most liable for yesterday's injustice have the most to contribute to the project of building justice tomorrow, should be asked for the most in that project. The ethos is then on construction rather than repair. We're building a new thing, not fixing a thing that exists already. So that puts reparations on the model of distributive justice rather than retributive. It's not about getting back at the wrongdoers, but it's about distributing the costs of a construction process. You could think of this, sometimes people challenge me, you could think of this as a relationship repair view if you want. That's fine with me. I don't, yeah, I'm not particularly inclined to fight with people over what to call it. But what's important is that there's different kinds of theory to do that we shouldn't confuse with each other. So if we're trying to figure out what we should build, then we need to look forward. What is the world that we think is just? What kinds of institutions does it have? What kinds of literal physical protections does it have in terms of seawalls and bridges and infrastructure? We need to look forward to answer those questions. But when we try to figure out who should be on the hook for doing what part of those, that's when we look backwards, when we look at history, when we look at the history of the British Empire and the US Empire, the French Empire, and so on and so forth, and the various multinational companies that were part and parcel from the very beginning of all the injustice and destruction that was wrought in the creation of today's world. I wish I could say that the constructive view does everything perfectly. I don't think it does, unfortunately. I don't think it discriminates quite as well as the other views do. If we change the world that everybody lives in, then we change the circumstances that everybody lives in. So it's not as clear cut as, say, the harm repair view, where some people are granting checks and other people are receiving them, right? But I think it does do well in the first two standards, which I've argued are the more important standards, right? I think it does address the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism as they are embedded in the actual structure of our planetary social and economic system. I think it does make tangible differences in material conditions of people's lives, insofar as that structure just is the material condition of people's lives, right? At least the aspect of the material conditions of people's lives that we can change. One thing that I want to emphasize when I say the constructive view is that I mean this literally. I'm not speaking metaphorically or using construction as an aesthetic. We actually need to build things. We should look at political values like self-determination and democratic equality as design principles of our construction project to build literal political institutions, physical infrastructure, incentive structures that get the job done of building a just world. We can take our cues here. We can learn important lessons from the universal design movement and from decades-long disability justice activism. You know, what access means is an aspect of the literal physical structures that you're around. Are there stairs or ramps that lead into the building that we're talking about? And it's that level of concreteness to our justice claims that we should be thinking about in general. And insofar as disability justice is part of justice, and of course it is, those literal claims are also part of what we should be thinking about in designing and actually building our new just world. And so it's at this juncture that we get into climate, right? The kind of surprising pivot that the book makes. Why is it that reparations turns out to have something to do with climate justice? And the way that I try to get people started thinking about this view is to just appeal to the fact that the construction part of the constructive view is literal, right? We're literally trying to build something. And so we should take on the kind of practical commitments of trying to get a project done, right? What are going to be the obstacles? If you were going to build a literal house, you would want to know if you had access to the right kind of materials. You would want to know if the ground that you're trying to build on could support the weight of the house. You'd have all these practical questions that aren't part of the conceptual process of defining a house, but are going to be make or break when it comes to actually getting the job done, actually building the house. And so it's from that perspective that I ask, will it profit a parent to be able to send their children to an affordable school that's burned to the ground or underwater? What I'm getting at is, if we don't succeed with respect to climate justice, if we have a world that's hotter, where the sea levels are rising, where our food systems are insecure, where there's conflict between great powers, as we're seeing right now, are we looking at a world that is hospitable for racial justice or inhospitable? And as the Africans trying to flee the war in Ukraine could probably tell you, I think inhospitable, right? I think that's a world that is not good for either advancing the struggle of racial justice or even just retaining the gains that have been won in previous generations. This has already been noticed by people who work on climate justice. Some people have used the term climate apartheid to describe a world where the rich escape overheating, hunger, and conflict. Another way to say that is that we can expect a new kind of social division and set of distributive justice problems when our social systems hit crisis. That's something that we should have learned during the pandemic, when there was a vastly uneven global response, vastly uneven distribution of vaccines, not because of any conceptual matter of what COVID-19 or coronavirus is, but because of the very deeply unequal social systems that we have to respond to public health crises across the world, whereas rich countries and the communities protected in them are able to exert a lot of influence over who and what is protected. We can expect new kinds of social divisions and intensified old versions of social divisions between those who can pay to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and those who can't. And we can expect that whether we're comparing individuals or households or neighborhoods, or in the case of climate colonialism, where we might be comparing countries or indigenous communities with the settler nations nearby. But at either scale, we can expect power to structure which places will be rendered most vulnerable and which places will be rendered least vulnerable. So recall, racial justice and injustice is, on my view, distributional. It's a matter of who gets what level of all these things: security, political power, resources, and money. And so reparations, which is also distributive, should be thought of in the same way. So broadly, if you take orthodox climate policy, I think reparations would call for distributing burdens towards the global north and the racially advantaged, and benefits of climate policy towards the global south and the racially disadvantaged, particularly Black and Indigenous populations, across the usual distinctions in climate policy. This is something that everyone tends to agree with in the abstract, and yet the actual distributions of money to climate adaptation and mitigation and loss and damage don't match this, these verbal declarations of policy. How could they? Well, one thing to talk about on the side of particular demands or particular things to push for and win under the heading of climate reparations are unconditional cash transfers. These have long been the gold standard of reparations discussion for a reason. In a world like ours, a capitalist world, this is a very direct way to change who has the ability to reap the benefits and burdens of our social cooperation. There's a lot of technical concerns that some people sometimes have about these, but I think those are better addressed to how unconditional cash transfers should be designed rather than whether or not they happen. I think these can happen at the level of individuals. You could give people trust funds or baby bonds under some measure of supervision. And this could also happen at collective levels. You could transfer money to communities, to global South countries, national governments. All these things are very good ideas, and they're ideas to put on Front Street. If we do nothing else, this seems like the thing to do. But maybe we want more than that. So I think alongside distributing resources, especially a very convertible resource like money and wealth, we should be redistributing political decision-making power, which is an important aspect of the pipelines of opportunity, the pipelines of social advantage and disadvantage that decide how the world goes. So this is often been talked about under the heading of energy democracy or community ownership of power, but you need genuine public popular control over how energy is distributed and produced. That involves nationalizing private fossil fuel companies, but as much of the world knows, where state entities are already in control over fossil fuel production, more is needed than that. So I'm particularly enamored by community level control and ownership of power. This is a much better political model, I think, than investor-owned utilities in general, which tend to center profit and externalize environmental costs, and then use the political power from that profit to block climate outcomes. I think if we want climate outcomes to be aligned with what public needs are, then we need to put the public in charge of the crucial aspects of our political and economic system that decide climate outcomes. We can also do this at the political level and not just in terms of the energy sector. This has already been done on smaller scales, starting with the Brazilian Workers' Party in Porto Alegre in Brazil, a model of using a kind of town hall format to make direct democratic decisions over how public funds get used. It's been used at a small scale in many cities around the world. The more money and resources that we allocate in this direct democratic way, the less is controlled by lobbyists and the politicians that they buy. So that's good as well. There is a clown car of other ideas that we could have that I think are also important. Debt cancellation, the contribution of rich countries to the Green Climate Fund, reallocating SDRs, which are basically International Monetary Fund bucks. Cities and countries signing a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I'm happy to talk more about any of these in particular as well, but I just want to give you a sense of the breadth of the kind of practical options that there are, and practical things that would fall under the heading of a world-making project. We're literally talking about redesigning the way that we live together on this planet in fundamental ways, and redistributing economic, social, and political decision-making power in a way that's going to be compatible with living together on terms other than domination. All of that is simply to restate what I said at the beginning, which is that reparations requires climate justice, and that means remaking the world. Thank you.
Thank you. it's such a rich talk, and I think you've condensed. I mean, the book is like 200 pages or something. You've condensed a lot of it into like those few slides, and so as a summary, I think we can delve into various details. I'm going to ask you maybe one or two questions as a kind of translation to the kind of philosophical, moral philosophy terms that you were talking in, and also some of the broader policy space type things that you were entering in towards the end. I kind of translate from that to the kinds of things that are more regular in the art system, the way that we talk about some of these issues. So it's to do with this notion of distribution, which I think is the fundamental term, right? So it seems to me that you're, I'm just going to make you the center of attention in the video frame. So there's the kind of, you have the discussion about colonial racial injustice, colonial racial oppression, racial capitalism. And I think that argument, or that sort of set of that truth, is kind of fairly well established now and sort of accepted as the basis for action in the present and towards the future. So racial justice is really like primary in terms of how we think about all kinds of other injustices as well. But I was quite excited by that threefold distinction between how we address this that you laid out. So you've got the harm repair model, which you're saying we look at past harms as the cause for the present bad situation or like harmful situation, and we try and fix the present in view of the past, right? So we kind of, reparations would be, there's been slavery in the United States that's kind of caused economic damage in terms of where goods and assets went for Black populations in the United States over 400 years. And so the reparation needs to be made around that loss of assets compared to white populations over that period, right? So you can fix the current hierarchy by just kind of allocating money in the present and sort of making things equal again. That's kind of what I understood the harm repair argument to be. And then the relationship repair, I think you said it fairly clearly. I don't need to rehearse it again, but we like improve relations between constituencies or different populations. And that's a bit like a rainbow nation, rainbow coalition. So, as long as we're all getting on, things are good. We don't necessarily need to look at past harm, because as long as we kind of have good relationships in the present, we can like look over that stuff. And it seemed to me those two models kind of describe more or less a good deal of what we see in the art and cultural space in terms of how to deal with this horrible legacy of racism. So on the one hand, it's, we excavate the past and sort of try and understand forgotten voices, memories that need to be kind of reconstructed and brought to our attention. And as though that in itself would be enough to overcome the legacies of oppression, because we're now aware and attentive to them. And on the other hand, we try and build constituencies where we do, a version of rainbow coalition. So we kind of try and overcome our differences and historically given antagonisms, and sort of build something in the present. The thing we don't see very much of is the third thing, the constructive view. And I'm wondering if that's because it's actually quite hard to give pictures of the distributive moment. So what seemed to me really important in your argument is that, we can talk about racism, and we can talk about the legacies of racism, and also the futures of racism as well, because as you were saying at the end, it's likely, as we saw with COVID, I think you mentioned, right? As we saw with COVID, it's likely that climate breakdown is going to just exacerbate and entrench historical racial inequalities, both within countries and across, within countries and between countries as well, right? So the what seems fundamental in your approach is that we're not just looking at the outcomes of historical racism, we're looking at how that stays in place through distribution models, and mainly capital distribution, but also historically entrenched. So some people have property, some people have assets, some people don't. And the real work is to kind of change the distribution, as you're calling them, pipelines, right? That's actually how you get like the constructive model. That's quite hard to picture because it's very processy. It's quite abstract. It's long term. It's kind of durational, and it sort of requires engineering rather than sort of representational images. So I'm wondering about two things, and maybe like there are two different questions here. One, just pragmatically, how do you approach, how do you make the constructive view sexy, to put it in a very crude way? How do you make it something that people can say, oh yeah, I can get a kick out of this, or I can feel I can immediately, I'm like doing good work. How do you get the affect of repair, moral repair, that you get with the harm repair model and you get with the relationship repair? Like those give you an immediate sort of like, I'm a good person vibe. The constructive view just feels much more fragile, I think, maybe affectively and also representationally. So I'm just wondering, like, you laid it out very clearly in terms of policy directions or programs, I think you were calling them. But it's quite hard to sort of attach to that in the same way that you could attach to the other things. So I'm wondering if you've given some thought to the sort of like appeal of that third model compared to the other two.
Yeah. No, that's a really helpful summation of what's going on, and a really clear one. And I think there is a problem here, which is the history, the approach to telling history that is bundled with the harm repair view and the relationship repair view flows really nicely into the kinds of tasks that those views put for themselves, and in a way that's really easy to experience, right? So if your way of thinking is the harm repair view, and you think, well, certainly slavery and colonialism involved suffering. We know how to depict suffering, and reparations for it would involve a check. We know what checks look like, and we know what it is to buy things. And so those are things that are easy to imagine, they're easy to communicate, so on and so forth. The same with relationship repair views, right? We know viscerally what it's like to not trust someone or to be angry with someone. We also know viscerally what it is to be in community with people, at least, whatever community is left post neoliberalism, right? But, we know what it is to have friends and to have relationships. And so both the problem and the solution are easy to imagine and easy to depict in arguments, in art, in discussion. And at least the problem side of the constructive view is not easy to depict, right? We don't experience processes, really. Like, we experience outcomes. Those are the more easy things to tractably experience, right? Especially if you're talking on a global scale, right? People just don't have a personal, visceral experience of, what their job has to do with the people working in sweatshops on the other side of the world. People might know intellectually that there's at least some kind of relationship between those things, but it doesn't have any obvious analog in the day-to-day things that people do experience. So for me, the answer to your question of how to make the constructive view appealing to people is to go all in on the solution side. So the way that the constructive view asks you to look at the problem is difficult to conceptualize, but the way that it asks you to look at the solution is the easiest to conceptualize of all of them, maybe, right? It's very clear the kind of change you've made to the world once you build a hospital that wasn't there before, right? Now there's a new thing. You know, we can see it, we can touch it, we can experience it, we can get healthcare in it. And if it wasn't for the building and the hiring of nurses and nurse practitioners and doctors and orderlies and all that, if it wasn't for all of this really tangible stuff, labor, construction, teaching, performance of healthcare, if it wasn't for all these things that we do experience, you know, there wouldn't be a hospital. And so the constructive view, you know, for all the problems that it has of, you know, giving a really visceral description of what the problem is, there's this hyper visceral solution. You know, are there stairs or are there ramps in front of this building? Right? There's nothing, you know, that is a very real physical reality, especially if you use a wheelchair or a similar mobility device, that, you know, we can very much experience the success or failure to implement. And people do very much experience the success or failure to implement. So I think that's the way to go.
There's a kind of just to build up on that. There's a very different affect involved in this, right? So with the harm repair and with the relationship repair, there's a sense in which when you're talking about the hospital as a kind of not just a proposal but an actuality, one, it's very pragmatic, right? You've got to really like work with other. I mean, building hospitals is a huge task with so many actors, right? So it's a huge kind of systemic thing that you've got to get involved in. There's also a sense of optimism or kind of like hope that the hospital repairs damage and can repair people into the future, because the people who will be sick maybe aren't born yet, but there will be, you know, I mean, I know there's lots of problems with healthcare and so on, but just as a kind of naive claim. So there's something speculative and there's something hopeful and sort of future facing about that proposal, right? As I think there is in general around the constructive view. Whereas the harm repair and the relationship repair seem to me, I think this might come back to some of the other argument you're making around elite capture.
Yeah.
Harm repair and relationship repair, because they sort of have to be attached to past harms. Like we have to remain in a world of like mourning and partial like grief around those past harms. And the repair that gets done is very much for the present, but it kind of settles there. You're not necessarily building that it's the basis for a future possibility, but we don't need to look at that because like I've arrived at a good relationship with you, or I've compensated you, so now we're settled and we can just get on with things. But there's no idea of what that next thing needs to be. So on the one hand, it feels like there's a forward-looking, optimistic moment in the constructive view, which has to be explicitly stated. And there's also something quite speculative about it, which I don't see in the other two models that you're presenting. Does that make sense to you, or is that?
No, that totally makes sense. And I think that's exactly right. And, you know, part of it, I think the most charitable way to look at it is maybe a fatalism, right? We can't be sure about anything in the future. The best we can hope to do is try kind of settle yesterday's scores and then let the chips fall. But I think, you know, for me, that's the optimistic view, right? Like for me, if it's incredibly optimistic to think that um regardless of the trajectory of human politics in an era where our very ecology is breaking down, that it will be good enough for your children or your children's children, for you or your generation or even their generation to get a check and an apology, right? And there needn't be any further account of what's going on in the world, and what's going on in the world won't be the kind of thing that would undermine the political importance of the check or the apology. I think that's a profoundly optimistic view, right? And it doesn't masquerade itself as such just because, you know, as you rightly said, it just isn't looking into what the future is going to be like, or at least not looking into what the future is going to be like with breath. But as soon as you do, I think, you know, it's the constructive view that is actually the least optimistic view of all of these. I think it retains some, you know, optimism, I guess, whatever optimism is involved in still thinking that we have a duty and responsibility to those who come after us, and thus, you know, maybe assuming that there's going to be an after us. Maybe that's, you know, maybe that's somewhat
First flaw in your argument. It's like,
yeah, true. But yeah, but beyond that, it's the other views that are the optimistic ones from my perspective. Yeah.
all right. So I'm going to open up to questions, but just as a little warning, if people can put their hands up or note it in the chat box. But I'm going to just ask you one more kind of translation question in a way, and it's to do with ontology. So in the sort of cultural art space, a lot of the discussion around race becomes a question of like ontology, semantics, affect, and so on. And I was wondering, the model of distribution you described seems very plastic, very mobile. It's to be made. So there's no essential being in it, it seems to me, which is also a way to kind of make racism just a specific historical and political issue, rather than something like Afro-pessimists might insist on, that this is an ontological condition of like Western humanity and so on. So I'm just wondering if you could, I mean, maybe also for people who don't know the terms that well, I'm sure you've got a much clearer understanding of how ontology is used in anti-racist discourse. So like if you could spell that out very quickly, even though I introduced the term, I'm going to pass the burden to you. If you just spell that out, and then like your view on the ontology stance, because again, I feel like that's the more common way it gets addressed from like the space that we occupy more.
Yeah. So you can imagine thinking about all these issues in a, let's say, differently ontological way, right? You know, maybe blackness in particular, or maybe race in general, is just the founding principle for being of our planetary system, right? Which isn't even that far from what I say, but it isn't what I say, right? What I say are that these events and social processes, transatlantic slavery and colonialism, and the attendant economic networks, that activity is what our world is built on, right? So is it the activity, or is it these kind of modes of identity, modes of being, and I suppose non-being, depending on who you ask, that emerge as a result of this activity? Which is it? I tend to think it's the activity, and I think so because there was a before the activity, right? The particular activity, and you know, presumably, at least conceptually speaking, there could be an after, right? And so I'm not personally drawn to, you know, talking about either blackness or race in general, as though the world could not be otherwise. Very recently the world was otherwise, right? I'm the first generation of my family to be born. I and my siblings and a lot of my friends, people close to my age, we're the first generation who weren't born um, formally colonial subjects of the British Empire, right? Nigeria's independence from the British Empire happened in my parents' life. That's different from now, right? It may not be different in the total, in the sense of total liberation and total racial justice, but it is meaningfully different. It isn't the same political system as when there were only 35 member states of the United Nations, many of whom were colonial overlords of most of the rest of the world. And tomorrow will be another day, and maybe something will be different about that as well. And I think we can kind of separate our justified lack of satisfaction after the differences between today and yesterday with a view on which, the things that matter politically can't meaningfully change. Yeah, I think that's what I'll say.
Okay. I'd like to follow up. I see there's a question from David Chami. Can you put your video on, David, when you're asking the question?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the talk. It was really good. I think my question is building on the ontological question that you were saying, Suhail. Because the way when you transitioned into the solutions, as you first put, primarily the cash transfers, and then you said you wanted to go beyond that. It was almost like secondarily, it seemed. So I guess then my question would be about distinctions, which just now you were kind of alluding to. How do you distinguish the worthy from the unworthy? And also, the ground for the argument was on the planetary-sized system that was taking place. It sounded like you were kind of like systems theory as the ground for the argument. So like, I don't know, like Wallerstein or like Arrighi or something. So like, would you, for example, consider within those distinctions, like the semi-peripheral countries of the world system, like at the time it would have been like Eastern Europe or something, who were semi-colonized during that period. So there's kind of like a weird problem with distinctions, I find. Like when putting it into concrete terms with cash transfers, it's kind of hard for me to conceptualize how those distinctions are made, I guess. If that makes sense.
It does make sense, thanks. And it's a really good question. So one of the things that I get off the boat with, and I say a little bit explicitly about in chapter 4 of the book, if I'm remembering correctly. I don't think the distinction is between the worthy and the unworthy. And in general, I think I'm kind of inclined to kind of jettison moral desert talk, which is very closely related to the framework of moral responsibility for understanding reparations. So that's why I use the term liability instead. And I just don't think the distinction between recipient and, I guess I should say net recipient and net contributor to reparations is well described by kind of interpersonal moral language like worthiness or blameworthiness, perhaps, or responsibility. I think I'm a little more mercenary about all of this. So I would prefer to think about liabilities, so how much of the costs or benefits you're on the hook for, and the corresponding claim rights on whatever redistribution we're doing on gradients. So it should simply, there's no need at all for a qualitative distinction between, which countries were really colonized or, all those sorts of things, and which were, solely the bad actors, right? We can just use social science inquiry and figure out, well, who was most disadvantaged by this history, who was least, and how do we rank order the people in the middle? And then the people who are most liable, the corporations, I should say, that are most liable, the countries that are most liable, have to kick in the most. The countries that were, and communities that were most disadvantaged, get the most, and everybody else is somewhere in between those. And you just don't need at all a conception of worthiness. You need some maybe tricky conceptions of disadvantage, and maybe some diagnosis of where the disadvantage comes from. But all those are answerable questions. And in fact, in some cases, on some issues, particularly wealth, social scientists already spend quite a bit of time doing things that functionally would answer those questions. And just to answer your other point, yes, world systems theory is very much a part of this, and got kind of absorbed by people making the arguments I draw from, especially on the racial capitalism side of things. So you're right to see that as part of this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Do you want to come back, David? Do you want to follow up?
No,
You
it's
don't
a
have to.
fine answer.
All right. I was going to ask you about, before Gabriella comes in with her question, I was going to ask you about the liabilities. So when you're talking about liabilities there, in terms of racial capitalism, the liabilities are, as we said earlier, to do with the histories of colonialism, extractivism, so on and so forth. So the liability is a historically incurred liability. But if we think about climate breakdown, we've got to think about future liabilities as well, right? So obviously the kind of, the discussion at the end around energy, the energy companies have future liabilities for the extraction they've already done, which is going to cost us for the next 10,000 years minimum in terms of climate change, and how the costs to alleviate climate breakdown. So there seems like there's two questions around liabilities there. Now, one you could historically track because you've got comparators, people who were extracted from, and people who benefited from that extraction. So like white and black in the dichotomy you showed earlier. But with the future-facing liabilities, it sort of seems like it's a kind of speculative point, because the liabilities have to be paid for now to mitigate their effects into the future. So it's it seems to me there's a kind of complexity in that notion there. I'm wondering if does that sound right to you? Is that my off the ball?
Yeah. It does sound right. But I think part of what I'm after with the design perspective is at least a gesture in the direction of what an answer to this complication would look like in a technical sense. So, there's the problem of starting today, how much should we ask for from companies A, B, and C and countries X, Y, and Z, right? And then I take it your point is, well, there's a version of answering that question that just takes into account all of the problems and harms that have accrued up until today. But we could imagine repeating that procedure in 50 years, or we could imagine making predictions about what will happen 50 years from now. In either case, we would come up with a different list of which people should be primarily on the hook, perhaps.
Or it's both lists.
I think it's yeah, exactly. So I think it's just both lists, right? And so if you're towards the top on either list, right now we get to ask more of you, whether it's taxes or fines or whatever, in the process of constructing a different world. And importantly, for my cases, the constructive view is not a view of reparations that involves a one-off policy action. Right, so I'm not saying, as you might under the harm repair view, for example, or the relationship repair view, exactly. I'm not saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then there's going to be some apologies, and then we've done reparations. The same kind of processual view that I have about history is being applied to reparations in general. All reparations describes is the distributive justice of the process of transitioning from this world to a just one. So there's nothing that prevents us 50 years from now from simply repeating the procedure, or every year, taking stock of who's contributed what so far to the transition effort, and who has who still owes, and et cetera, until we get to the just world. We could continue doing this. So it's more processual, it's more programmatic than you might get to on other ways of thinking about reparations.
Yeah, I just want to keep talking to you. We're going to hand over to Gabriella, because some more interesting things to ask.
No, not at all. I think I could talk about this for a really long time. It's kind of, thank you so much for taking the time to explain all of this to us, Femi. I guess my question isn't super pointed, but it speaks a bit to, kind of things that are happening more locally where we are. So our school, I don't know if you've ever been to this part of London, in Deptford, but basically, historically, it was one of the major ports that a lot of the slave ships had stopped at. So there's this very heavy history that is very evident in kind of the population and the landscape still in this neighborhood. And, goldsmiths being an institution, and then, kind of producing a lot of artists coming out of this particular area. Even though a lot of us are internationals and we come from other places, in a way we're new settlers. And I find it quite difficult to navigate my own kind of presence in an area that is still predominantly Black, still predominantly what would be called like low performing in the neighborhood, and low performing schools are around here, like just the obvious, results of what colonialism has done is still so much alive and very, very visible. And it's very like strangely kind of geographically like closed off as well. And you cross the bridge and you're in a very affluent area. And so knowing also that like wherever artists, from what I understand too, is wherever the artist goes, the area becomes quite gentrified slowly afterwards. It seems to be kind of like, if artists are around, like start building and start making money, because this is like, it's trendy and it's, cool, and we kind of bring back some sort of quote unquote culture to the area. So it's hard as artists to kind of, for me as well, is just to be so aware that like I'm kind of complacent in this sort of system that you talk about. And then also just how that is all automatically implied in the profession that we're doing as well. And I just wanted to know your thoughts a bit on that, and potentially how you see kind of solutions as artists. We're naturally become, we get very passionate about things and passionate about specific like subjects regarding capitalism, but at the same time we are complicit in it, and it is kind of what we have to do in order to succeed as artists. So it's a paradox, and it's quite challenging to not feel gross about it sometimes. So I just was wondering, like, yeah, I'd love to hear your feedback and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I have so many. This is really interesting line of thought, and like it's something I've thought about a lot as well. As a musician. For me, I guess I'll say just a few things. So the first thing is, I think there's an insidious aspect of the way that we have been asked to relate to political outcomes on the level of like moral rules. People talk about privilege and people talk about complicity. And I think it's an outcome that I think it's an outlook on capitalism, racial capitalism, global racial empire, politics. I think it's an outlook on politics that's really corrosive, I think. I think it's corrosive. And I'll just give you a couple of reasons why. One, there are people that are really responsible, that are identifiably responsible for what happens to rent and housing security in a community. And I see you nodding, so right, right, it's developers, it's landlords, right? It's there are people who, not in a moral sense, but in a concrete, not in a moralized complicity sense, but in a concrete decision-making sense, simply operate the levers that in fact explain the things that we're trying to relate to in this moral sense. And this is connected to why we were talking earlier about, my reticence to use shame and guilt and responsibility language in terms of reparations. I think this is another extension of the same kind of ethos. It's not to say that where you as an artist lives has nothing to do with these outcomes that come later, but it's just to ask, why do we spend so much cultural energy thinking about that aspect of the huge causal structure that explains who can live where and who gets what quality schools? Why do we accept a moral framework, an aesthetic framework, a cultural framework that directs our attention to there rather than to the landlords? I think it's coming from a good place. Obviously, people don't want to be part of the problem, but it's a way of avoiding being part of the problem that neglects particular ways that we can be part of a solution. Right. So I'm gonna get my hammer and sickle out for a second, but just like, it's complicity is a narrative for thinking about these issues. It's just the furthest thing from any successful political movement that challenged any of these things. It's the intimate relationship of enslaved people to the labor that made plantations run, and that propped up the political powers that benefited from plantations. It was their relationship it was their causal, complicity, we could say, in keeping that system running, that was the source of their ability to destroy it. It is the complicity of the proletariat. It is the fact that they are involved in making capitalism run that explains why they are potentially revolutionary, because they're withdrawing their labor in strikes and so on and so forth, poses an existential challenge to the system doing what it does, right? So the question isn't how can we avoid being part of this bad system. The system is the size of the planet. It is our involvement that allows us to survive. That's the primitive accumulation story. Sorry about all the random, Marx references. But hopefully,
we'll forgive you.
Still making sense.
Just move past that.
but yeah, like complicity just changes the question from a strategic question that we could ask about what we're going to do about the system, to just more a question about how we should feel about ourselves given that the system is going to persist. And I just don't see any reason, I don't see any good political reason for asking that question of yourself, this guilt question of how to feel about yourself, not as an artist, not as a potential organizer, not as a human being. It just isn't the question. It's never been the question. It never should be the question. The question is what we're going to do instead. And that's one of the questions that art answers directly, because, aside from, organizing and political struggle, there's just the perennial question in any era, a just one or not, of like what we're going to do on this earth. And, there's still going to be guitars post-revolution, right? There's still going to be paint. I think it's fine to just do that.
No paint.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm ranting. I apologize. Yeah.
That's fine. I was making a joke just to provoke the patrons. Need some questions.
I was like, I said too much.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a really good point. Gabrielle, do you want to come back on?
No, I think that's it's very interesting what you're saying, and it's true. The question isn't really about, oh, how can I make myself feel better about, being in these spaces, or kind of being part of this, like a cog in a system. But like you said, it's to acknowledge kind of the bigger structures that are existing, and kind of how to navigate those in a way that you can kind of help push it slowly in the direction of more of a more equity-based society. And yeah, I'm from Canada, and I see a lot of this in their Truth and Reconciliation Committee, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with Indigenous peoples. And there's this aspect also of like this performativity. And it's, in fact, they are doing things, but they're not, it's very slow, and it's not exactly like at the pace that I would like it, or I think it should go, or that it could actually go right now. It's being slowed down by bureaucracy and all, again, which is part of those systems. So I just find that really, I really appreciate your insight on all that. It's very interesting. Thank you.
I mean, I think the question you're asking, Femi, I think your answer is also kind of what you're talking about in the being in the room paper and the elite captures. So like in Femi's talk last year, like the first invitation was very much around this question about how do these kind of large macro historical future facing, kind of really significant, like these are world making, world changing demands. And then we come into the room and we end up scolding each other because one of us is more privileged than the other, although we're kind of all trying to do the same thing. And there's a way in which, if I'm paraphrasing what you're saying, Femi, correctly, there's a way in which the kind of macro picture, the thing we really like, the justice claim, gets acted out in this kind of very micro, like interpersonal way about who's the most or least privileged in the room. And that's, I think you're saying, is the kind of corrosive mistake of trying to locate all these injustices on individuals. We're all compromised. Like, we're all incredibly compromised. The question is, what do you do with your position of compromise, or with the compromise that you have to negotiate? And I think the thing you were saying earlier for me about, it's the slaves on the plantations understood the conditions by which to get rid of the plantation, the slavery. Right? It's not at all the same thing. I'm not wanting to equate them, but in terms of the capitalism, the transnational capitalism we're in now, where we're kind of dealing with these kind of neoliberal flows of sort of migrant populations, a kind of internationally organized cultural space. We occupy that. I mean, this is what the contemporary art space occupies. It's like at the forefront of it. Music's probably the same, depending on music it is and so on. It feels like there's a way in which we're very close to a current operation of power and economics, partly because of the huge amount of interest from like the super rich in contemporary art, which actually gives you an insight into how to move around it or through it, or I don't know. I think that's partly what these discussions are about. Like we're having a really high level discussion, but actually that's to our advantage in terms of thinking about how to address the moves that now need to be made, right? So the question of whether it's representational or processual or distributional, that seems to be a fundamental question, but it's not something that kind of asking about, when you leave the gates of Deptford and then you face like what's in front of you, it's a different order of experience, but I don't think we need to feel bad about asking these questions.
Yeah. I mean, there are definitely questions to ask. I think, I'm sort of two minds about it, because on the one hand, I do think art matters politically, both in terms of, who artists have access to, and just in terms of art itself as a cultural force, right? I think both of those are relatedly but separately important. But I also think, the peculiar thing about art is that art isn't like organizing, in the particular sense that like art would be worth doing even if there were nothing to struggle against. Maybe it would be most worth doing if there were nothing to struggle against. And so, part of me, thinking less as an organizer, more as an artist, gets worried that politics, even good politics, might colonize art in a bad way. And so there, I think one of the difficult things is, how do we balance an appreciation for the political importance of art with an appreciation for the non-political importance of art. And I think that's another interesting set of questions that, I end up posing to myself a lot and don't really have answers to. But I do think, what I'm wanting to get away from are, ways that we've been socialized into asking about art's political role that put ourselves at the center of it. Right. So, how do I avoid being problematic? How do I avoid, leaning into my privileges the wrong way? And I just don't think those are the questions. Those aren't those are questions and we should ask them, but they're, to me, way down on the priority list. The central questions are, how do I make good art? Artistically good art, and then maybe, how do I make politically useful art, or how do I inhabit the art world in a politically useful way? I think those are questions I would put on the top.
Yeah, the problem isn't about me. The problem is ours. So there's a question from James Tapish, which he can't ask because thanks, Gabrielle.
Thank you.
So James can't ask it, so I'm going to ask Maria to ask the question to you.
James asks, when I listen to these ideas, I tend to agree with the constructive approach as the only possibility for justice, but also come away with kind of complacency that really it is the big actors like nations and the IMF that are the only possible effectors of these necessary policies. I wonder how to fight some of this complacency and start to map out how the small scale of action might connect to the large scale, so we don't all go away and continue with business as usual, or at least minor involvement in gradualist demagogic politics as usual.
It's a really good question. Some of the slides I took out were about this. I now regret that. But but yeah, I think that's one of the daunting things about looking at politics on this scale. It starts to seem like it's, like the only people that can really do something about this are like the Chinese Communist Party and the US government or whatever, like these huge political actors. But I think I think two things. One, I think there are important local victories that can be won and would matter and would advance this politics regardless of what the bigger scale politicians are doing. So I think, for example, winning public utilities in a place that didn't have them before in a particular city would be a victory that didn't require the entire country that city is in to necessarily follow suit, right? I think ground can be won at very local levels of action. But two, relatedly, I think any plausible story of why national governments, multinational corporations, etc., would do any of the things that would be justice promoting would have to involve mass grassroots translocal mobilization. Right. So unfortunately, the particular examples I picked made it seem as though it's national, international level politics that would be driving, when I think, if anything, the opposite is true. Right. The people that and institutions as they are now at that level are kind of hopeless by themselves. So, the things that we should do are to try to win local victories and to try to scale those up into meaningfully different international, national level actions. So just a couple examples of how we might do that to kind of get us thinking in that direction. Divestment movements, right? Divestment movements have been particularly on the side of fossil fuel divestment, but there's also been important divestment movements against carceral state in the United States. There's been important divestment movements against many other things, but those are ways of getting international, global ramifications of local level movements. As divestment campaigns succeed, the global multinational investor class changes their behavior, right? And certain movements of capital which looked hunky-dory yesterday start to look like risks to them. And so that's a very clear, articulable way in which local campaigns can have impacts on other scales. And I think there's maybe even a clearer kind of way. In the US, there's a movement for this that's being called the Bargaining for the Common Good movement, but it's more or less just getting back to a broader conception of what it is that unions and organized labor can fight for. But something that I suspect you all know well, or would have heard of, but you know, people can strike over lots of stuff, right? And the demands that you make aren't necessarily just about, or needed necessarily just to be about the wages and benefits of the people in the movement. And workers during, for example, the anti-apartheid movement knew this well and used this to help put pressure on social systems larger than their immediate employer. And I think whether we call it bargaining for the common good or just anything else, this is something that people, exerting political pressure with unions on larger aspects of our social system is another way that more grassroots kind of politics can have political effects that are important and that transcend different levels of political scale. And so I think those are just a couple examples, but we should definitely be thinking about local battles and grassroots mobilization in general.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm not sure your call for more strike action is going to be very welcome with the students of this thing. No.
Yeah.
Although I mean, you've already delayed your talk like 3 times to get to this point, so the fact we got here is just like success. But yeah, I mean, I think that there is a local version of what you're saying, which is that the Goldsmith strike has been recognized as one what's called of national importance within the union language, because it's not just a strike about the management, it's also about marketization of it, privatization of education. So it's kind of like not just about people being sacked or like what's happening in the college. It's because of the reasons we've come to that point. And that's a kind of much larger logic, I think, is what you're talking about. But I was going to ask, when you talk about collective action, it's still, just to again do a translation question back to how we tend to work in the art space. And I guess for musicians it's slightly different because you're working in groups or bands or whatever, but it's quite individuated action and sort of personal. So I'm wondering if there's if there's something about where at the with the proposals you had at the end, I can sort of see that the policy designs, right? I can't remember the exact term. You had the sort of program designs for the various things to do with energy and organization, so on. And I'm wondering if we're thinking about climate justice or climate breakdown and what to do with kind of forward-facing reparation, there's quite a speculative moment in that. So the examples you gave are speculative examples. They're happening at sort of medium to large scale organizations. But I'm wondering if there's something about giving texture and precision and also a kind of affect to these speculative moments that actually, people can invent on their own. Thinking about, Michel Fair has got quite a nice argument about reputations in investment capitalism, where you just need to kind of, and there's a lot of this online, where kind of discrediting somebody or discrediting an organization, this is a version of divestment, right? So you kind of discredit Shell or discredit Exxon. And then that leads to nervousness on the part of the financial investors. And so there's a kind of withdrawal from it. It doesn't take many people to do that initial discrediting. It just needs to be virally strong enough. That's kind of, there's a right-wing version of that as well through Trump and Twitter and the rest of it. So I'm wondering if there's kind of things around making narratives, making images, which sort of can inform the kind of speculative dimension of kind of constructive repair.
Yeah, totally. I think, there's the 2 families of questions, right? So how do we make building something better and just beautiful, right, and appealing, and attach a positive affect to that? And then how do we make status quo extractivism and austerity not just lose the intellectual argument, but how do we make it actually unappealing and disgusting and and give people some kind of visceral purchase on what it's actually doing. And on both sides of that, I think there's a tremendous role for some determined artists to play. Absolutely. And I don't know, I don't know exactly what it would look like, but it seems important for exactly the reasons you pointed out, right? It is a form of divestment that turns into like the form of divestment that capital considers, right? It's attached to how we actually respond to things.
Yeah. I feel like we've worked you quite hard, but there is one more question that's just come in. Are you able to take it, or do you want to? Yeah, Maria, could you read it? Maria?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you now.
Hi. So Sasha asks, I was wondering what your perspective on mutual aid is. I come from Richmond, VA, and the conversation around reparations has been ever present. But coming from a state that on both local and national scale has always leaned towards a conservative agenda, I was wondering how you think the role of individual community members outside of political platforms can play an effective role on shaping the way we organize grassroots mobilization.
I think it's especially at the local level. I think it's it's one of those things very underrated in importance in terms of it's hard to imagine anything succeeding without something like this, without mutual aid, without community building, right? Social movements are social, right? Whatever else they are, they involve people getting together, working for something, and then tomorrow doing it again. The things that seem like intangibles and seem like, not the stuff that hard-nosed materialists should be attending to, things like trust and concern and mutual support. Those are the material conditions for, those are among the material conditions for doing any kind of activity, including organizing with people in a sustained way over time. And any kind of action that builds that, but especially kinds of actions that build that while building political organization, I think are critically important. They're undervalued, and we've got to do 10 times more of that stuff, especially the neoliberal world where a lot of people's alternatives for those things are being eroded out from under them.
Great, that's a really nice point to finish with. Thank you. All right, so thanks, Femi. That was like, went on much longer than, but really great, again, rich, complex, like involving talk. So thank you for that. And like your kindness and staying with us for this long, such an involved way. All right. So thank you everyone else. And I'll see you again on whatever that date in May was. I think it was May the 9th for these talks, and I'll see some of you in the other teaching and so on. So I'll be in touch with you, Femi, later about follow-up to this. No more questions though, just like, boring admin. Okay. All right, thanks everyone. And thanks for bearing up with us through all this strike stuff, which we now understand to be a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. All right, take care.
Thanks, bye-bye.